Thank you, Rina, and thank you, Elma, for showing this animated video. It is very powerful in terms of the work that we are doing, bringing both the gender and the renewable energy aspect together. Good day, dear participants and speaker. My name is Muzaharul Alam. I'm working for United Nations Environment Program Asia and the Pacific Office as a regional coordinator for climate change, and I'm your moderator for today. Let me begin by welcoming you all to the Making Connections That Matter, the Gender and Climate Commitment side event at the Asia Pacific Climate Week to discuss how science and the policy can work together for inclusive, more just, and climate resilient future. This event is jointly organized by UN Women and UNEP under the project called Empower in short, with the financial support from Swedish Development Cooperation Agency. We have very exciting lineup of speakers, and they will bring wealth of experiences in the science policy nexus. As we go along the agenda, please feel free to put your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A function of the Zoom. And I also would like to mention that you will also see the chat function in the Zoom, but we'll be using that chat function primarily to greet other participants. But for the Q&A function, please use it for your queries and any questions to any speaker that we have today in our session. May I also request the speakers to keep eye on the Q&A function of the Zoom and respond to the questions directed to them during the session. This will also help us to make use of our QA, the dedicated session at the very end of the session. Without further ado, I'd like to request Mohammed Nachiri, the Regional Director of UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, to deliver his welcome remarks and kick us off for the session. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mudharul, and a very good morning and a warm welcome to everyone tuning in to this year's Asia Pacific Climate Week. As we all know, it's a very important platform for governments and all stakeholders involved in climate action to review the climate commitments and explore strategies for sustainable and climate-friendly recovery from COVID. 2021 is a historic year for global climate action. It's the year we start implementing the Paris Agreement, and it's our opportunity to increase global climate ambition in COVID recovery and kickstart a decade of action. In the run-up to the much-awaited COP26 that has been delayed by a year due to COVID, governments around the world are preparing for the next round of the global negotiations, which aim to increase commitments and accelerate the progress towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement that include limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and continuing to foster climate resilience across the globe. By default, a sustainable recovery and the achievement of these climate goals will need to address gender equality concerns so that no one is left behind. The inequalities of the modern day society should not be perpetuated in the green economy that we all are striving for. Climate activists, civil society, and private sector are expecting to see more ambitious nationally determined contributions that will contribute to higher emission reductions and better resilience to the increasingly devastating climate change impacts. So far, we see that the level of climate commitments falls short of what is required by scientific assessments. Also, we have observed that in the updated climate commitments submitted in 2020, the levels of gender equality ambitions vary significantly from country to country, though we take note of the higher levels of recognition of the role of women in climate resilience in this round of submissions. However, a lot more could be done to ensure long-term, equal, fair, and inclusive climate action. As climate scientists work tirelessly to model and update pathways to remain on track in achieving the temperature target, social scientists need to look at our beliefs, behaviors, and actions, complex social systems, in order to address the deeply entrenched discriminatory social norms and gender-based inequalities that prevent climate solutions from being inclusive and equitable. The knowledge on the nexus of different disciplines, environmental and social sciences, is invaluable for inclusive and just climate policy making, yet it is also often contested as the policy responses are incremental at best. I'm excited in the session today, we will be able to learn from our speakers who will have worked on the science policy nexus at global, regional, and national levels, on how gender studies and feminist approaches have successfully informed climate actions. We will hear what is the status of gender inclusion in the nationally determined contributions in the Asia-Pacific region broadly. And we will also hear from exemplary efforts in Nepal, Vietnam, and Cambodia on the experiences around the preparations of gender equality in climate change assessment reports, and more specifically, how these assessments could influence the climate ambition of different government agencies. We look forward to the inspirational examples and recommendations that will emerge through today's discussions, and based on the integrated science policy assessments that cover gender analysis in sectors such as renewable energy, agriculture, water and waste management, and forestry. We see this as an opportunity for regional stakeholders to have their voices heard in the UN climate change process as we approach COP26, and hope to inspire countries in the Asia-Pacific region to embark onto the journey to improve the science policy interface to build fair and inclusive climate action. Thank you all again for joining this side event. I wish you all great and inspiring discussions. And back to you, Modharul Lal.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for highlighting the gaps we have to achieve the goals under the Paris Agreement, but also highlighting the need of the gender inclusiveness. And then what I was even pursuing in another meeting, that it is not only the issue of the gender inclusion, but also consider gender as a driver to bring the solution and foster the solution to address the climate change. So with that, I'd like to now introduce Johnny Sager. She's a professor of global studies, Bentley University in Boston. Johnny is a feminist geographer and environmentalist. She has worked in environment and the development fields for many years to bring gender perspective into the global environmental policy and assessment. As an expert in the gender environmental analyst, the feminist methodologist, and the global environment policy, including the many policy recommendations in climate change. We are very grateful that we have Johnny with us, and all the way from Boston, and it is evening time for her, and thank you very much for sparing your evening with us. Over to you, Johnny.
Well, thank you very much, Babu. Let me start my timer here so that I stick within the constraints that that we have for this panel, that everyone can have time to speak. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm honored to be part of this panel. And on Zoom, Boston doesn't seem so far away. So from where you are there in Asia. So good morning to you from my evening. So what I'd like to talk about briefly are two main large frames of data and explanation, and try to wend our way to thinking about where and if we can find or form the convergence of science, policy, and gender. So let me just say as a preface that when I use the term science, I'm actually talking about biophysical sciences, and I'll try to use the term physical sciences. So we have the physical sciences kind of at the table. We also have the social sciences, and that by social sciences, that sounds very academic-y. I don't mean it in an academic sense. I mean analyses that bring in experience and the complex social structures that were mentioned before, and experiential understanding. So physical science, social science, both rough words that roughly capture those two orbits. So what do we know about the social sciences and the physical sciences? Let's start with the physical sciences in terms of climate change. Physical sciences completely dominate knowledge in the climate change world. They completely dominate as experts drawn upon by the public and by policymakers. When policymakers or the public wants to know what's going on in climate change, whether things are getting worse, whether things are getting better, never, but whether things are getting worse and in what degree and to what extent, everyone turns to the physical scientists. And the terms of knowledge that physical scientists use is about parts per million of this and percents of that gas and rates of deoxygization and rates of acidification, language that most of us are familiar with, even if we don't use it individually in our own work. I should say also there's a whole other group that also has kind of the head of the table status when talking about climate change, and that's economists. And they use different but more related terms of analysis, GDP rises and GDP losses and financial metrics. The expert structure of the physical sciences, so the terms of knowledge of the physical sciences is precise physical measurements of physical phenomena. The expert structure is mostly male. Obviously, there are women in the physical sciences, but really when you look at the physical sciences related to climate change, geologists and meteorologists and atmospheric chemists and marine chemists, and if you include the economists, then the econometrics, this is largely a male expert structure. When we turn to the social sciences, the main terms of knowledge, the main terms of reference are about social drivers and social impacts, social justice, increasingly today talking about social justice, looking at effects and experience within these complex social systems. The strong presence of women in the social sciences means that when you put these two kind of frames of knowledge side by side, they look very different. They're in very different orbits. So one of the questions then is, how do we frame our understanding of climate commitments? How do we come to terms? And I mean that kind of loosely, with each other. I think one of the real points of convergence, but it's quite problematic, is the need for more information. Scientists are always looking for more data, and gender analysts are always saying we need more information, both experientially based and qualitative, but also quantitative. Everyone's chasing some quantitative data. But those are very different. So that's a great point of convergence. Everyone wants more data, but very different data needs. And again, the data regimes in climate change to date are almost entirely constructed by and cater to the physical sciences. There's almost zero gender analysis in the mainstream data sources on climate change. Even our dear SDGs, I did a quick look before this meeting. So at rough count, there are about 232 data indicators in the SDGs. About 54 of those are classified as gender indicators by UN Women. And there are about 93 classified as environmental indicators. So if you have this set of 54-ish gender indicators and 93-ish environment indicators, how many of them are both? If this were in a classroom, I would actually ask people to jump in and say, I'll tell you, 8. There are 8 indicators that combine gender and environment in the SDGs, which is a very kind of sad state of kind of a quick glimpse at the state of our data regimes. A few years ago, in 2016, the framework for the UN framework for the development of environmental statistics was developed and released. I did a quick look at the FDES, and there are only 5 points. This is the framework that the UN recommends to governments who are trying to develop their own data systems. And the UN says, let us help you out. Let us give you a framework for how you might collect environmental statistics. And exactly 5 of them combine gender and environment. I'll just make one more point on the paucity of data that brings together gender and climate change. I use often a couple of the big international disaster databases, such as MDAT. I'm sure many of you do too, or at least familiar with them. MDAT collects no gender information. They collect information on numbers of deaths, numbers of injuries per disaster incident. That's not gender disaggregated at all, for reasons I don't even understand, because if you're collecting information on deaths, it's like not a big leap beyond that to collect the gender information associated with that death. So anyway, so there's not, so this quest for data, which consumes both the physical sciences and the social sciences, is not a point of real convergence. It's a point I think could be of real convergence, but it's not yet. Much of the physical science work and the social science work is looking to the future. And here again, we find a big difference between the physical sciences, which look to the future by modeling concentrations of gases, and the social scientists who look to the future by trying to project out generational experience and social consequences. Of those two, the modeling of physical phenomenon and attempts to examine and extrapolate what will happen socially and generationally, the social frame is actually not very respected at all. In serious policy and serious scientific circles, the talking about human consequences and human traumas and human losses is considered to be soft and kind of not serious in a policy. It's a very marginal analysis to the main institutions working on climate change. So let me just say, in the minute I have left, I'm keeping close track of the time, it's very hard to see where we could join or converge. However, we can sit side by side. If we can make room at the climate change table, metaphorically as well as literally, for the social sciences to sit with the physical sciences, first of all, we will learn a lot from each other. And I think one of our goals as gender analysts will be to try to persuade and encourage the physical scientists who really have the floor, they really have the attention of the world, to at least mention the human consequences and the human drivers of climate change. And I think that should be our goal for every meeting we're in. And at that, I'll stop and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johnny, for insightful the information. Particularly, I would like to just take 2 things what you have mentioned among many others. One is like a journey between the biophysical scientist group and the social scientist group. And a journey began in the climate change and dominated by the climate, the physical scientists, because it's actually considered as an environmental problem. And the social scientist and the human development, that aspect became prominent when in one hand, that the global community failed to limit the greenhouse gas emission and the impacts became more visible. And that's the reason also the journey began slightly later from the social scientist group. So in that context, when we talk about that we need to expedite and enhance the action, I also see that the social scientists, that community, also need to expedite to generate the data and information and to bring these two disciplines in an equal footage. So thank you very much for highlighting that need and make the right or the equal convergence of the two communities. Thank you very much once again for highlighting that. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Amy Rogers, who is Gender and Climate Consultant of UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Amy has been working in international development for 20 years with experience researching and working in various countries in Asia and the Pacific region. For past 7 years, Amy's professional experience has been working for UN Women country offices in the region on gender and climate change projects, including research, policy analysis, and the technical advice for the government counterparts. Amy will give us an overview of the status of the gender inclusion in the recently updated the Nationally Determined Contribution 2020 in the Asia Pacific region. Amy, floor is for you.
Thank you so much, Babu, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody today. Thank you very much to the organisers for the opportunity to share this research. And just as I start my screen sharing, I couldn't think of a better introduction to sort of my presentation today from our previous speaker. Something that we're really we're really trying to do in this piece of research is exactly what you really hit home on in your presentation, in terms of how do we generate this data in the social sciences, and how do we put it together with our physical scientists and in an equal sort of weighted way. So that's what we've been trying to do here. So as part of a collaboration that UN Women has with UN ESCAP and the UN Environment Programme, we've been conducting an assessment on climate ambition and the enabling factors to support the implementation of NDCs in the Asia Pacific. And UN Women has sort of been charged to conduct a large gender assessment of climate change laws, policies, strategies, as well as an assessment of gender equality frameworks to understand how gender and climate links are being realised in this policy context. And that's what I'm going to share briefly with you today. And although I will share some of the preliminary findings, I think what's really important in this conversation that we're having is to really talk about the methodology and this process of generating data, as Joan pointed out already. So as you can see on the screen here, we are looking at measuring gender integration in the NDCs. And in order to do this, we've been following the 4 enabling factors matrix, which has been developed by UNESCO, UN ESCAP and UN Environment in a previous preliminary assessment that happened in 2020. And we've amended this for the purpose of assessing the gender component of climate action. And so what we've been busy doing is we've assessed almost 50 countries in what we call the Asia Pacific region on these 4 different enabling factors. So you can see here the first one's on mainstreaming, which looks at climate change laws and policies that integrate gender equality issues and women's priorities. The second is on coordination. So what coordination mechanisms include gender focal points, links to national gender machineries, or that specifically include gender expertise in climate, and also how is climate change integrated into national gender equality frameworks at the national level. The third enabling factor is on finance. And what we're trying to understand is how is gender integrated into climate finance, including into gender action plans under the Green Climate Fund, and also looking at gender in MRV. So how is gender as a part of the monitoring frameworks for climate change, and where is the use of sex and age disaggregated data in reporting, not only on climate commitments, but also in terms of gender commitments. And so we are working particularly on this enabling factors side, and all of the evidence from for this assessment has been sourced from NDCs, from national communications, national adaptation plans, climate change laws, policies, strategies, as well as looking at gender equality laws, policies, frameworks to understand where climate change is brought into that conversation. And they're also looking at the reporting in terms of gender equality, so CEDAW reporting and the Beijing +25 for national reviews. So let me tell you what we found. These are preliminary results, and I'm just going to give you a short flavour because I don't have a long time today, but the report will be coming out later this year ahead of the September meetings that will occur. But I guess without going into also too much detail on all of the scoring, all of this will be available in the final report. I did want to give you a little bit of an example. So for the first bullet point on mainstreaming, we found that 34% of countries scored either a 4 or 5 on the mainstreaming of gender and climate change laws. So what that means is 0 being the least positive score and 5 being the best score. 34% of countries scored either 4 or 5 in terms of mainstreaming. So what that could look like is perhaps across their different policies, there's an effort to explore gender inclusion and climate links, and there perhaps is also links to women's empowerment. Maybe for a score of 5, countries would have had explicit links between gender equality and climate change. They would have had gender equality as a guiding principle or an overall objective. There will be links to SDG 5, and there may even be mention of the CEDAW sort of framework on women's rights and how that's related to climate change action at the national level. So to give you a little bit of an essence of some of the other areas and scores without going to, again, too much detail due to time at the moment, we had about 23% of countries that have some form of gender inclusive processes, and they report on this. So that includes specific mechanisms to involve women's machineries and explicitly integrate climate change into gender equality frameworks. So thinking things like national gender equality policies or gender equality laws also have a connection to the disproportionate impact of climate on women. In terms of gender action plans and in the context of finance, we found that 63% of countries have a gender action plan under the Green Climate Fund. However, which does mean there will be, in fact, finance specifically dedicated to gender. But what we also found is that aside from the Green Climate Fund, very few countries mention gender and finance in their NDCs or any of their relevant policies. And in terms of monitoring, overall gender integration in MRV, in general is very low in the region. And there are still very few commitments to collect sex and age disaggregated data. In fact, 57% of countries did not recognise the need for sex and age disaggregated data or have gender indicators across their different their policy documents. So just finally, before I finish up, I'm also trying to watch the time closely. What does this mean? And I think this also brings us back to what Joni was saying before, this critical importance of gender disaggregated information to inform assessments. We know that gender equality and climate change is linked. The research has been telling us that for quite some time now. However, there is still this need for assessments that analyse gender equality issues and really try to kind of quantify in many ways those links to climate change. And this assessment tried to use both qualitative and quantitative gender analysis tools and processes and bring it into this much larger data set to analyse climate ambition and the enabling factors. And gender is given equal weighting in the formula, which we're putting together across all of the enabling factors. So that's really important. And I think sort of a couple of takeaway messages. I think when we think about this assessment and the analysis that's been conducted, it really provides a baseline of data on the integration of gender in Asia Pacific NDCs. And this, as I said, this data is really put side by side with climate-related indicators such as greenhouse gas emissions, such as decarbonisation commitments, etc. And it contributes to the overall score of a country's climate ambition and the enabling factors in order to help them support that ambition and deliver on it. And this approach can be used as a measurement tool. NDCs have a 5-year update cycle. And so we can use this as this baseline and work to measure the improvements of gender equality in the enabling factors. And hopefully, you know, as Babu had mentioned at the very beginning, you know, we've seen a really remarkable increase in NDCs, including gender. And what we're trying to do here is break that down and say, well, how have you included gender? And try and measure that, you know, across those enabling factors so that we can really give credit where it's due, but also try and analyse and work out how this is going to lead to effective NDC implementation. So I'm right on time there. So I'm going to move to my last slide, which is thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Amy, for highlighting the assessment work and how we are actually trying to bring the gender aspect and giving the equal weightage in that assessment. And this is the work that UNESCAP, the UNEP, and the UN Women were working together under the issue-based coalition. So we are also putting our effort that the Johnny, you have mentioned about the whole issue of the data, the information, and the assessment. So from our side, we are also trying to contribute to that area. So thank you, Amy, for highlighting that. Now, this is a very good way of moving to hear from the speakers who is actually joining us from the 3 different locations and 3 different countries. And then we'll be doing a bit of a more deep dive into the country examples and then how the country is actually dealing with the gender inclusion aspect. As I mentioned that we have the 3 speakers, and I will introduce one after another. So we have Chandra Gurung, we have Nguyen Selin, and we have Moni Nong. So let me start with Chandra Gurung, and is a senior gender specialist and leading the work in the gender area in the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development based in Kathmandu, Nepal. She has a strong knowledge on gender issues, gender equality, women's rights, and other aspect of the gender, along with the wide experience in applying the method and approaches for effective integration of gender, poverty, and the social dimension in development agenda and processes. So it's my pleasure to hand over to Chandra Gurung to share the experiences. Chandra, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mazarul. First of all, thank you for inviting me to present about some of the major or key findings through the study on the state of gender equality and climate change in Nepal. I will just be giving a very broad overview of the findings. Let me just share my screen. Give me a second. Just a second, I'm sharing it, but why is it not happening? Just give me a second. Okay, yeah, it should be there. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it is there. Maybe if
Yeah.
you kindly just make the full view.
Yes, I will do so. Okay, it should be there. I've just made it into full. Okay, I guess you can see now clearly.
Yes, please go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah, okay. So I will, as I said, a very, very broad overview of the major findings that this study came out. So let me start firstly with some of the really key findings and recommendations, very broadly what we see in Nepal. In some way, Nepal has, I think, reached is progressing quite a bit in trying to really integrate gender, mainstream gender in climate policies and actions. So what we see is both the climate policy of 2019 as well as the latest NDC that was passed in December 2020 to address gender and social inclusion concerns, both for mitigation as well as on adaptation context. But having said that, what we find is the focus when they include gender and social inclusion is really on vulnerability. Okay, these groups are vulnerable. We need to do, that kind of a vulnerable angle to it. And the second is they also, the government institutions, they also have mechanisms and structures on to mainstream gender or integrate climate change and gender. And so it's there, all there. However, when it comes to operationalize, there is still a lot of confusion, a lot of things happening. There's really very limited or even lack of gender responsive budgeting to do this. And then, as my earlier speakers have also said, monitoring, evaluation, as well as learning outcomes or reporting is kind of, it's just not there at all. So this really, like you have it, but how do you operationalize that? So as a result, so some of the recommendation based on these major findings, what you said is that I think it's time to focus the shift, from this vulnerability lens to these groups of women and, the marginalized groups as primary stakeholders who are also contributors to climate, change, and also as active agents of change, because they are not, just because they are vulnerable doesn't mean they are passive. They are doing things to adapt, to mitigate. So I think that shift has to happen urgently. The second one is, I think we need to really have this gender responsive climate financing mechanisms in place. Unless it is there, no matter how many action plans you have, how many objectives, you are not going to reach that in the way that you have set your goal or target. And finally, the other one is to really support these, development innovations that are coming about and integrate this with the MNE to see that these outcomes are inclusive of gender and marginalized groups. So this, then I would like to see on as we've mentioned in the beginning, the science policy discussion. There has been a lot of discussions. When you look at the trajectory of climate change in Nepal, the policies, there has been many instances where there has been such discussions, and there has been some positive outcomes too because of these discussions from scientists talking about gender and social inclusion. A basic thing that is really important is that now what we call JC, that is the gender equality and social inclusion focal points, are there in the ministries of different sectors. Yes, there are certain still loopholes, but at least these people are there. And second is, if you look, the distinct targets have been made. Like if you look at the mitigation component target under the agriculture and forestry and other land use, Nepal is a successful story of community forestry systems. So you have this community forestry system user groups, and it's mentioned by 2030, these user groups should have 50% of women's representation and a proportionate representation of the lower caste in the key positions, not just as members. And if you look at the agriculture policy, Nepal was really lagging behind in women's ownership and property. So they have set a target for by 2025, the farmlands, 50% of the farmland should be owned by women. And so these are good outcomes. But we also see a major research gap. And this is, not looking at the intersectionality of gender with caste, class, ethnicity, age, including geographical location, especially for a country like Nepal, where there's so many socioeconomic cultural groups. and in the geographical from high mountains to the floodplains. If you do not look at this intersectionality, we do not get a real picture. Because there's this problematic understanding even now of gender as just women, particularly rural women, and all these women are same. So, and the policy response, what we have said is the collection of disaggregated data, not just only gender and sex, but the other social stratifiers. So this is a big thing that the policy could do to help get this focus. And finally, I just want to touch upon some good practices at the different levels. So if you look at the policy level, there is a sectoral policy, especially if you look at the Ministry of Forest and Environment, because that was one of the sectors we look at. And this sector is one which is really advanced compared to other sectors regarding integrating gender. So it has a gender policy there, and which really contributes to effective mainstreaming of gender and social inclusion in the entire sector. At the institutional level, just to have a separate reporting of the JC progress. Usually this reporting just goes somewhere, it's hidden. But if you have a separate reporting of the JC progress, you can actually track what is the progress that's happening, what are there. And at the program level, we have this great one, which we found, like to have identity cards of farmers, which are categorized into the most marginal groups. And they have actually helped in ensuring these most marginalized group, most vulnerable groups to access government services and subsidies. They have advised government to revise their subsidy policies or provisions of subsidies. So it reaches these groups based on their specific needs. So I think it's time almost. So I will stop here. I'll be happy to take in any questions or clarifications required. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandra, for sharing the work and the key findings and the elements from Nepal. Now it's my pleasure to invite Naguan Silin. He's the senior researcher in the Institute of Strategy and the Policy on the Natural Resources and Environment in Vietnam. Lin's specialization is in the natural resource management and the climate change, the policy analysis. Lin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Moha, and thank you all, and especially thank you UNEP and UN Women, to especially Rina for making this webinar happen, and also thank for our distinguished speaker Zoni for providing a very comprehensive remark at the beginning. So I will say my presentation is more on focused on some issue, some lesson learned from our assessment on gender and climate change in Vietnam, which are funded by the UNEP and UN Women last year, and we had a dissemination workshop in in April. And I had about 30 minutes, and now I had only 8 minutes to share with you. So I think that it's really important when we're talking about the science and policy. And as Jenny mentioned about the science, it's like here it lies the hard science or physical science, and also the gender is actually more or less on the social science. So I think that in order to mainstreaming the gender into climate change, it's really important to identify the entry point as well as the key stakeholder for gender integration into climate change action planning. And this one very much relevant to different level. At the national level, should much also different with the provincial level, and also who is a stakeholder. As you mentioned in my screen here, it's like we in Vietnam, the policy making structure for national policy formulation system is quite different, and we had the communist party at the top. Normally, they provide to issue the resolution or directive that provide direction for National Assembly or government to develop the law or strategy or resolution to in order to achieve the strategic objective or direction. So at the National Assembly, normally to provide the legal framework, such as law for the government to develop the degree or decision and so on. At the government, it normally develops the strategy and plan and some decision, action plan and so on. At the military, under the government and military also has some circular and joint circular and so on. So I think that in Vietnam, the institutional setting for gender equity and for climate change separately, it's quite comprehensive. And there are some like military, the icon is like key stakeholder for gender equity is the Ministry of Labor, Invalid and Social Affairs. It's more like we call it like the military in charge of gender issue, and also regarding to climate change in Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment in charge of climate change issue. So in terms of institutional setting for both issues, separate. I call it like wicked issue. It's like gender and climate change had been set up, but the linkage between those is still weak. And here is the finding from our assessment in 2020. We look at the policy of 4 sectors. And we review a number of climate-related policy of that sector. For example, in our country, we review 8 policies, and there are only 2 policies had gender indicators. For water management, we review 18 policy at the national level related to climate change, and there are no gender indicator mentioned in the policy paper. And on the come to waste management, there are 6 policy review, but only there are 3. Actually, 50% of the policy paper had a gender indicator inside it. For energy, and we focus on renewable energy, we review 9 policy, and there are no single policy mentioned about the gender indicator. So, and another thing that I think that during our review, we at the national level, we found that there are 2 positive things and 2 negative. The positive thing is the institutional and policy framework for both climate change and gender equity in Vietnam quite comprehensive separately. However, the integration of gender into climate change is still weak, especially another positive point is the law on formulation of legal mention about the requirement for gender integration in legal document. Normally, the new law had to include the gender settlement and gender integration, but like the circular and another one, it lies implementing policy is no mention about the integration or requires the integration. I think that understanding the interaction between the research community and policy maker is really important, and also defining the perspective of like 2 wicked area like gender and also climate change are key factor to lead to have a better integration of gender in climate change policy at the own level. And I see that there are 2 sides. One is gender, another is climate change. Gender more on the social thing, and gender perspective is really important. And from the climate side, climate change policy maker, I think that it's really important to know what the policy maker needs, and also such as the indicator or data and so on. Then what type of information should be provided? For example, fact sheet or policy brief, or maybe the data, and when is it best to discuss about the gender integration into climate change? Such question, I think that's really important, and the interaction between 2 sides had to be continually and in different way. And I mentioned that different level of policy making should have different approach, and identify the key stakeholder in formulating the policy also really important. At the moment, we know that the national, the government of Vietnam is developing, reviewing the strategy for climate change, national strategy for climate change. So I think that they also need some indicator, gender indicator to put in the policy document. So at that time, what's the gender side, gender specialist can provide is really important. The next thing, I think that there are some challenges and also the way forward. For example, like during our study, we think that the capacity and awareness on gender equity in the climate change response is still limited. And I think that gender and climate change are both considered as a wicked issue. So we need to require a simple approach, and the data over there, but we need to interpret the data and information for the policymaker. There are also knowledge of gender sensitive issues related to climate change can be provided, and also need more evidence-based study. And also there are no facts about the benefit of mainstreaming gender into policy formulation and implementation. So some more evidence-based would be are needed and provide the facts. And also there are no technical guidelines on mainstreaming gender in climate change policy.
You kindly summarize it soon, please. Huh?
Yeah. So need a technical guideline for deployment with the involvement of researcher, policymaker, and practitioner. So I think that the linkage should be come out with a concrete guideline. So because of limited time, so I stop my sharing now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for sharing the details. I'm also mindful about the time, so let me move to our next presenter, Monin Nong. Is a researcher, as a research associate at the Center for Natural Resources and Environment of Cambodia, Development Research Institute. In short, is called CEDRI. Monin is involved in various research projects relating to climate change vulnerability and assessment, environmental impact assessment, gender and the climate policy assessment, the water management, as well as the hydropower dam development. So Monin, over to you, and if you kindly help us presenting in 5 to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, moderator, for your kind introduction, and very good morning, everyone. My great honor to be here to present some key findings of the assessment report on gender equality and climate change in Cambodia. So I would like to start with our result and key recommendation here. In our national policy of gender and climate change, we highlighted 3 major issues. One of which is specific guideline on gender or climate change implementation. Second one, lack of knowledge and in-depth skill on gender analysis. And the last one, so far we don't have a specific gender indicator in the climate change monitoring evaluation framework. So to tackle the issue, we come up with some recommendations. First, we need to build strong coordination and facilitation among key governments agencies work together on gender and climate change. Secondly, we also need to expand and use gender-related research, lesson learned, and best practices by engage all key relevant stakeholders, including research institute, academia, NGO, and CSO. We also strongly need to climate change and gender monitoring evaluation framework at all sector level to ensure gender responsive mechanism being achieved. And finally, the financial and human resources are also critically needed in this process. So in terms of the role of science in the policy, everyone may know well that all the governments, including Cambodia, is committed to combating the impact of global climate change and promoting genders. So all work to fulfill its responsibility and obligation under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. And we can see the number of documents were produced to support the NDC regulation and commitment. Those documents include the INDC, updated NDC, first, second, and third National Communication Report, biannual update report, and other policy-related documents. So part of these promoting gender equality and enhancing environmental sustainability and climate resilience are also included and receives much attention in gender and climate change response in the most prioritized adaptation and mitigation action. So the role of science and research are to contribute to reduce gender impact of climate change, being more gender responsive in the respective objectives, and acknowledge the important gender role in policy, strategy, planning program, supported by the specific action plan. So we include key force sector here, namely energy, agriculture, rural development, and forestry in the analysis. We found some gap referring to the distinct perception of policymakers and science who perceive different regarding regulation and implementation. For example, in the energy sectors, to reach the target, for example, by 2023, by the policy, all villages and households are expected to enjoy access to electricity throughout the country. However, from research and science point of view, we see that the access to electricity is not equalized among the rich and the poor, women and men, including other most vulnerable groups. So this is because of the unreliable and low quality of power supply. As the World Bank report in 2019 found that just a quarter of the total household in Cambodia could access to a good quality of electricity supply. So in this sense, we need to do more on in terms of electrification by diversifying other sources of energy such as renewable energy that fit best in the remote village. Other gap we also find that occur in the rest of the sector like agriculture, rural development, and forestry. Most of the sectoral policy acknowledge the gender role in their respective sector and subsectors. However, the issue is that there is no gender analysis section or does not identify the differential impact of climate change and when on women and men. Yeah. And there is no disaggregated data on gender for the analysis. So the role of the policy of the technical levels, we can
Manin, may I just request you to wrap up, please?
Okay, so here all decision making needs strong science-based evidence to back up and influence policymaker, and the crucial role of the technical level officer in driving higher political commitment. So when the policymakers support gender equality in climate change action, they must accept the issue and take it into account as most of the prioritize and urgent need to enact it soon as possible in line with the transparent, transformative method and mechanism. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you very much. All the three presenters sharing their experiences from the countries. And as I indicated that we have the Q&A, and I was just keeping eye on the Q&A. And I think we have two questions, and I will request, if possible, Johnny to respond directly in the Q&A section. And I'm seeing that Lynn is typing the responses, so I will also request the other two presenters to respond to those. So with that, I also would like to invite INCAR, our partner from UN Women, to actually run the Q&A. I know that is in a very small number. So INCAR, are you here?
Unfortunately, Inkar is not on the
No,
line.
I'm not seeing his. Yes, no, he's not online. Sorry for that. So let me just quickly mention those questions so that all the attendees will know that. So the first question to Johnny and asking your opinion, what are the practical measures that will realize the convergence of the physical and the social sciences so that we can ensure gender equality integrated into the climate action? So maybe I will just request, no, Johnny has also left. So Rina, maybe what we can do, we can pass this question to Johnny and we then get the answer from her, and then we will include it in the report that we'll be preparing, and then we can also share it with the participants as well as the person who has actually mentioned it. But if you kindly just mention your name, because it says the anonymous attendee, so we'll not able to get back to you. So if you kindly also give us your email address so that we know who you are. And if we need to get back to you, we'll able to do that. So with that, from UNEP and the UN Women's side, I'd like to thank all the presenters to share their experiences, as well as all the attendees listening us early in the morning of Thailand time, and also the keynote speaker who joined from USA late in the evening. With that, I'd like to thank all of you. Stay safe, stay well, and stay in touch with us. We need all of you together to advance the gender, the climate change, the integration aspect together. Thank you once again. Bye for now.